Okay, so the next step in making your bone broth is taking the bones, which are in this bowl here, and adding them to your pot with basically the leftover fat and drippings that are in your pan, as well as some vinegar and then some water. And the idea of this is that the vinegar is going to interact with a little membrane on the surface of the bones to help release the nutrients that are actually in the tissue of the bones. Now, most of us, when we think of bones, we think of something that's fairly hard and maybe something that's all dried out and maybe not so useful to us anymore. But in fact, almost 80% of the tissue that's in your bones is actually stuff that keeps the bones slightly flexible. So as we cook the bones down over the next 2 or 3 days, what we're going to try and do is actually break down the connective tissue, the flexible part of the bones, and have that come out of the actual bone into the broth, which is why we call it a bone broth. What we're also hoping to get is the dissolved tissue that we call connective tissue, which is that soft, flexible part that we often relate to as cartilage, tendons, ligaments, and things like that. And as it turns out, the actual molecules that make up connective tissue, like cartilage and things like that, once they dissolve into the fluid, into the broth, and become more liquid, they're actually the most bioavailable of any other form. If you chew these things up and swallow them, it's a lot harder to digest. Something I'll probably get into a little bit later. But for now, I've taken the 2 chickens, I've pulled most of the meat or the flesh off and put it in this bowl. I've taken the bones, the cartilage, and the skin, any other fatty chunks, connective tissue, and put it in this bowl. I still have all of the fatty drippings and whatever flavors and stuff like that is still in this large pan here. So what I'm going to want to do is basically prepare my pot, and a good thing that I'm using here, actually this is a pressure cooking pot, but any pot that's fairly tall. The idea here is that as the broth, the water, the bones, and other things starts to heat up, the idea is that it can come up to the top and then basically condense into well, from steam to condense into liquid and then drop back down into the pot itself, so that you don't have to keep constantly adding more water. So here's the idea. I'm going to take all of my fat and drippings and pour them into the pot. Set that aside. I'm going to take all my bones and connective tissue and add that to the pot. And then what I want to do is basically add some vinegar. Now the vinegar, again, has a very specific job as an acid, and that's to break down this little membrane on the surface of the bones. So what I like to do is about 1/4 cup of red wine vinegar per chicken. So that'll be 2. And then 1/4 cup of apple cider vinegar, preferably organic apple cider vinegar. And a tricky thing about apple cider vinegar, which you may or may not be able to see on the camera, is that it should have what's called the mother, or a kind of thin tendril of growing material inside the vinegar, which just means it's actually got some more bioavailable and bioactive ingredients. So about 1/4 cup again for each chicken. Changes the flavor a bit, but also just adds some other nutrients. So now what I want to do, and I'll probably bring the camera over here just so you can see it, is spread this all out and then just cover it with cold water. And I want it to be pretty cold, and then I want to let it sit for at least an hour, maybe more, just to let that chemical reaction work. And after it's sat for about an hour, hour and a half, then I'm going to boil it. I'm going to boil it for an hour, and then I'm going to simmer it overnight. So tomorrow morning, right now it's about 9 o'clock at night, so tomorrow morning we'll come back and take a look at this, maybe after a close-up. And what I want you to see is basically in the morning how it looks after about 7, 8, 9, 10 hours of being first boiled for an hour and then simmered overnight. And then we're going to basically check it, clean things up a little bit, and then simmer it for the rest of tomorrow all day. So that's our plan, and let's make some bone broth. So there's the bone broth, basically cold water, vinegar, the bones, the drippings. What it's going to do now is basically sit for about an hour, hour and a half, and just work away. One thing you can do about halfway through is just massage everything with your hands to pull off any flesh off of any bones that are in there, say for this piece example, just to make sure that the vinegar and water has direct access to the actual bones themselves. So call that an optional step. But anyway, the idea here is let the vinegar, the water, and that membrane on the bones work together to break down to make what's inside the bones more available. So again, we'll come back tomorrow morning after it's been soaked for an hour and a half, boiled for an hour, and then simmered overnight. Okay, and here's the bone broth after being cooked for about 14 hours. Although it is in a pressure cooker, I haven't sealed the lid and used it under pressure. It's just a convenient sized pot for the amount of bones that I have. So I'll just move this over a bit to make it easier to see. So as the broth does a bit less bubbling and boiling, what I want to do is look for basically anything that's white and stringy and black and stringy, which is basically vascular tissue, and or actually not white and stringy, but white and foamy, which is basically destroyed proteins from being at too high of a temperature for too long. And that's why you basically want to just boil it for about an hour, hour and a bit, and then simmer it overnight. So because it's a fairly clean broth, in the sense there's nothing on the top I really want to get rid of, what I'm going to do with this is basically just let it simmer for about another 24 hours, and then take the bones out, clean them off, crush them, and put them back in. And add some vegetable material, usually the leftovers of the plants that I buy or grow here in my garden. And as I've probably said before, about 70% of the nutrients that are in the plants we eat are in the parts we typically throw away. So we'll come back and check this out in about 24 hours. So the next step in making a really good bone broth is to take out all of the bones, the connective tissue, and the meat that's in the broth, and basically put them in a bowl, which I'll do right now. And what you're going to want to do is basically clean off the bones. Now, this has simmered for about 30 hours since the last step. And about 10-12 hours into that time, I put in about a half a bottle of red wine and a few slices of garlic, just to infuse the broth with more flavor, and also to increase the breakdown of the bones themselves. You can see there's not a lot of huge bones in here right now. There's a good part of them that dissolved. So, what I'm basically going to do is, once this cools off, take the bones, clean them off, crush them, put them back in the pot. So I'll give this a few minutes to cool off, and then we'll just go through that process. And you're not going to want to put the meat or the connective tissue back in. You're just going to let the bones go in there, break down some more, and we'll scoop out whatever's left of the bones after that, put this back in there, and then we're going to add some vegetables and some spices, and then we'll have a really enriching, healthy broth. So just let these cool off and be right back. So now that the bones have had a chance to cool off, just going to clean them. And again, if you soak them in vinegar, put wine in your broth, it's as simple as just pressing down like that to break them open. Crumble them up. And this is the bone marrow here, which now can dissolve into the broth completely. And that's full of really good medicine. So just clean them, crush them, crumble them up. And make sure you don't lose any of the marrow, because that's the good stuff. Now, just thought I'd mention something that's kind of medically interesting as I do this. Now, some people have the idea that if you take calcium and magnesium, vitamin D, stuff like that, it's going to give you stronger bones. And in a way, that's true. I mean, they're important building blocks for your bones for sure. There's other things, zinc, boron, stuff like that. that make your bones strong as well. But the most important thing is actually the part of your bones that make them more flexible. And that, of course, things like gelatin, basic amino acids and stuff that are actually in the flexible part of the bones, because actually the calcium and magnesium is what makes them possibly more brittle. So if you don't actually try and take everything that makes bones strong, you might be actually making your bones more brittle. So, just another reason why bone broth is so full of really healthy nutrients, because it not only contains the minerals like calcium and magnesium and things like that, fat-soluble vitamins like vitamin D that help your body build the bones, but it also has all of those flexible parts of your bones, the proteins, that actually make them really strong and flexible. So we need them both. Just another reason why bone broth is so good for you. So after I've crushed up all my bones, I'm going to put them back on the stove for a few hours, simmer them to clean off the marrow, and I'm going to leave most of the meat and other connective tissue and skin in this bowl, because what I really want to do is just wash off the bones. Some more of the bone will dissolve into the broth, and then I'm just going to scoop out and strain off whatever's left, put that in the compost, and then this goes back into the broth as an enriching part of it, and then we'll add some vegetables to make it even better for us. So we'll look at that in just a moment. So the next step to make your bone broth is to take out all of the bones after they've been cracked and then cooked for a few more hours. I put them in a little strainer just to make sure that I can pour hot water over top of it to clean off any last little morsels of good gelatins and fats and other good things. So that's basically what's left of 2 chickens after about a 3.5 day process of boiling them down, simmering them. I'm just going to pour this hot water over again to make sure I get everything that I can possibly get out of the bones. Which, as you can see, is quite a bit. Now this is going to basically go in the compost, and then I'm going to pour the rest of the soup through the strainer here, the stock, just to make sure I can strain out anything else that might get in my way. Little surprises can be uncomfortable sometimes, so we'll do that in just a second.